Hello, literary themes and poetry students. Today we're going to be dedicating our class period to a discussion of Derek Walcott's Ruins of a Great House. Derek Walcott is a very important 20th century poet, originally from the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Poetry late in his life. I believe in 1992. He died in 2017, a few years ago. He's a great poet of post-colonial themes. One of the key issues with Walcott is that he was born of mixed parents, so he is part native St. Lucian and part British, and so he has this kind of hybridized identity and a kind of a conflictive element about his poetry, precisely because he's both colonizer and colonized. And probably the key critical perspective we take with regards to Walcott's poetry is what's known as post-colonial. I'm going to read you a little definition of post-colonial theory and discuss it briefly. So post-colonialism or post-colonial theory refers to a set of theories in philosophy, film, and literature that grapple with the legacy of colonial rule. As a literary theory or critical approach, it deals with the literature produced in countries that were once or are now colonies of other countries. It may also deal with literature written in or by citizens of colonized countries that take colonies or their people that takes colonies or their peoples as its subject matter. Post-colonial theory became part of the critical toolbox of the 1970s, and many practitioners take Edward Said's book Orientalism to be the theory's founding work. Post-colonial theory deals with many issues for societies that have undergone colonialism, the dilemmas of developing a national identity in the wake of colonial rule, the ways in which writers from colonized countries attempt to articulate and even celebrate their cultural identities and reclaim them from the colonizers, the ways knowledge of colonized people have served the interests of colonizers, and how knowledge of subordinate people is produced and used, and the ways in which the literature of the colonial powers is used to justify colonialism through the perpetuation of images of the colonized as inferior. The creation of binary oppositions structure the way we view others. In the case of colonialism, distinctions were made between the Oriental and the Westerner, one being emotional, the other rational. This opposition was used to justify a destiny to rule on behalf of the colonizer, or the white man's burden. You may have noticed in that definition there are certain things, prejudices about racial prejudices, that we can see parallels with gender prejudices and things that we've looked at earlier in the semester when we were looking at some of those traditions of love poetry. Some of those poems have at their heart kind of preconceived stereotypes about the nature of men and the nature of women. In post-colonial literature, very often we confront some of those same stereotypes with respect to race and racial issues. So very often in English literature, there's kind of a rich vein of post-colonial criticism, precisely because English and England was a colonial power, and English is a language, a global language, but many of the places that it is spoken happen to be places that are colonial dominions of England. Obviously, England is a country, and then you have colonies or former colonies or even current colonies of England, starting with places like Ireland, which was a colony. Canada was also a colony. And you have places all over the globe, India, in Africa, in Asia, pretty much spanning the globe. At one point, there was a famous expression, this is from the 19th century, saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that had to do with the fact that the British Empire spanned the globe. So at any point during the day, it was daytime in some area that was under colonial dominion of England. So that's kind of an important backdrop for this particular poem that we're going to be looking at. There are a couple of other contexts that we want to think about. The first one would be that the title. The title of the poem, Ruins of a Great House. Obviously, ruins, we can understand what ruins are, and we see within the poem that the building that we're looking at and talking about is, in fact, in a state of disrepair and decay. The Great House, however, refers to the large house on a slave plantation. Typically, the Great House is where the person who owns the slaves lives or lived, and so the greatness of the Great House has, it has an imposing structure. Typically, it's usually very big, and it's usually also very luxurious relative, obviously, to the places where the slaves live. Now, even in the title, there's a little bit of a nod to some British poetic tradition, because in the 1800s, in the 18th century, there was a fairly rich tradition which is known as great house poetry, where in England you typically had these very wealthy noblemen who would often have a second home. They might live in London, but then they might also have a country home, a manor, where they would go and spend their time, their vacation time, go hunting and go walking in the woods and things like that. And there became a tradition of writing these kind of elegiac odes about these great houses that they had. Now, typically, those were people of a very high social class, and there's a little bit of a tradition of pastoral poetry wrapped up in that, in the sense that these places were these very large homes, as I said, out in the countryside, and they embodied some of the joys of rural life. Again, what we saw when we talked about pastoral poetry early in the semester. So we have, this escape from the corruption of the city and this embracing of a simpler, more wonderful lifestyle. So that's kind of just hinted at implicitly within the title of the poem. The poem starts with a quotation. Okay, it's actually an epigraph, something that starts the quotation that begins the poem. It's outside of the poem. Though our longest sun sets at right declensions and makes but winter arches, it cannot be long before we lie down in darkness and have our light in ashes. And that's from Thomas Browne's Urn Burial. That's a text, just that we don't need to go too far into discussing what exactly that text is, but just the title of it, Urn Burial, suggests something, right? And so it's a poem. This quotation from that poem is embracing the theme of death and this sense of a setting sun and a setting sun of a life. We've seen that metaphor again and again. We've seen it in Shakespeare. We've seen it in, where the day going to night, that diurnal cycle, is an embodiment of the passage of time and also of recognition of mortality. So all of those things, we haven't even gotten into the poem yet. We've looked at the title and we've looked at the epigraph that precedes the poem, but we already have a tone set. This is a pattern that we're going to see in a number of the poems we'll look at in the coming weeks, where we have this decay and this ruin that is indicative of something else. And so we want to keep that in mind. Now, as I said previously, Walcott is a Caribbean poet from St. Lucia. St. Lucia actually has the curious distinction of having the highest per capita number of Nobel Prize laureates anywhere in the world. It's a small island, and there are two Nobel laureates, Walcott being one of them. The other one is someone who won for a prize in chemistry. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. But having two Nobel laureates in this small island makes it the place on planet Earth with the most Nobel laureates per capita. The poem is conjuring a little bit of a Caribbean past. And again, if you know anything about the Caribbean and those islands, many of those islands, places like Jamaica, Bermuda, St. Lucia, where Walcott is from, the Bahamas, there's a whole number of them. They were typically early colonial outposts for the British Empire. You have a whole rich colonial history in the Caribbean. You have French islands, you have Martinique, you have Dutch islands, you have the Netherlands Antilles, and you have Spanish islands, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. And so you have this whole slew of former colonial possessions. And so these islands, which now are most well known to many Canadians and North Americans as vacation destinations, when you go looking for sun and fun, you might go to Jamaica or to the Bahamas or something like that. And those are islands that now have tourism as a great part of their economic structure. But previously, many of them had a strong association with the transatlantic slave trade. Many of these islands the inhabitants are often the descendants of slaves. Sometimes there's a Creole reality where you have people who were brought over as slaves from Africa who have then bred with other European people. And so you have this mixed mestizo reality to them. But basically, one of the issues in the Caribbean was that it was a place strongly associated with the cultivation of sugarcane. So many of these islands, that was their raison d'etre as far as the European colonial powers were concerned, that these were places, they were temperate and generally good climates, and it was easy to produce cane sugar, which Europe started to have a pretty large appetite for, and it generally doesn't grow so well in Europe. But it's also very labor intensive. So it was strongly associated with the slave holding tradition, much like in the American South, where the cash crop was cotton. Cotton is also a crop that requires a great deal of labor to bring it to market. And so slavery was very closely tied up with cotton production in the American South. In the Caribbean, it was closely tied with, as I said, sugarcane production. And the British used a lot of sugar. Eventually, as we moved towards into the 1800s, the later 1800s, there became a movement to boycott sugar, and that was associated with a movement to finish slavery. And slavery was outlawed in Britain in the 1830s. However, most of the slavery that British people were involved with didn't take place in Britain. Took place in the Caribbean, off of the British islands. And so they were a little bit slow. While they abolished it on their home territory, they were a little bit slow to abolish it in their colonial possessions. Similarly, in the American South, slavery was not outlawed until 1861 with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was basically related to the American Civil War. So for the period preceding that, slavery was still in effect. Now, the reason that's all important here is because this is a poem that I mentioned entitled Ruins of a Great House that deals with, at its heart, the legacy of slavery. And in particular, there's kind of a moral stain of slavery that lingers. The context of the poem is a speaker visiting this former slave plantation in the Caribbean. It's not clear where, but there are people walking around looking at this former great house of a slave plantation and commenting on it. And so what ends up coming up from the poem is a bit of a commentary on this place. I will read the first lines of the poem, and I'll go back slowly and make reference to precisely some of the allusions that Walcott's making and some of the imagery that he's employing here. So, as I said, the poem begins with the epigraph from Brown's Urn Burial, but then it continues, stones only, the disjecta membra of this great house, whose moth-like girls are mixed with candle dust, remain to file the lizard's dragonish claws. The mouths of those gate cherubs shriek with stain. Axle and coach wheel silted under the muck of cattle droppings. 3 crows flap for the trees and settle, creaking the eucalyptus boughs. A smell of dead limes quickens to the nose. The leprosy of empire. Farewell green fields, farewell ye happy groves. Marble like Greece, like Faulkner's South in stone, deciduous beauty prospered and is gone, but where the lawn breaks in a rash of trees, a spade below dead leaves will ring the bone of some dead animal or human thing fallen from evil days, from evil times. It seems that the original crops were limes, grown in that silt that clogs the river's skirt. The imperious rakes are gone, their bright girls gone. The river flows, obliterating hurt. I climbed a wall with the grill ironwork of exiled craftsmen protecting that great house from guilt, perhaps, but not from the worm's rent, nor from the padded cavalry of the mouse. And when the wind shook in the limes, I heard what Kipling heard, the death of a great empire, the abuse of ignorance by Bible and by sword. A green lawn broken by low walls of stone, dipped to the rivulet and pacing. I thought next of men like Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, Drake, ancestral murders and poets, more perplexed in memory now by every ulcerous crime. The world's green age then was rotting lime, whose stench became the charnel galleon's text. The rot remains with us, the men are gone, but as dead ash is lifted in a wind that fans the blackening ember of the mind, my eyes burned from the ashen prose of Donne. Ablaze with rage, I thought, some slave is rotting in this manorial lake, but still the coal of my compassion fought that Albion too was once a colony like ours, part of the continent, piece of the main. Nook shot and rook overblown, deranged by foaming channels and the vain expense of bitter faction, all in compassion ends, so differently from what the heart arranged, as well as if a manner of thy friends. The poem is quite poignant, I think. It's kind of brutal. It's obviously talking about something that's somewhat disagreeable. And one of the key issues within this poem is kind of the dehumanizing nature of slavery. And the speaker here is somewhat tormented by that for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, Walcott's hybrid ancestry of English and African ancestors is important for the purposes of this poem because the persona in the poem is somewhat conflicted. The context, as I said, is somebody visiting this great house, but his attitude about it is, I don't want to say ambivalent, but complicated. So we start with the recognition of the place, the description of the place. Stones only, the disjecta membra of this great house. Disjecta membra is Latin. It actually comes from Horace when he talks about disjecta membra. It means the scattered bones, and he uses it to talk about the scattered bones of the poet. So stones only, the disjecta membra of this great house is kind of, this is what's left. The house is no longer really a house, it's a ruin, and it has, the quality of a ruin. It's falling apart, it's broken down, but something of it remains. Some aspect of this formerly great house remains. And of course, one of the things that remains is an aura of the activities that took place there. And those activities are somewhat horrific, I think. Slavery is horrific, frankly. Enslaving other human beings and treating them as property is a terrible, terrible thing. And the poem kind of confronts some of that. So we have this house lying in a state of decay, of ruin, sort of. And the speaker is climbing over these ruins. And, there's something strange about visiting ruins. If you've ever had the luxury of going, to a place like Chichen Itza in Mexico, the Mayan ruins, or Machu Picchu in Peru, these formerly great places, and there's something curious about visiting them from a historical perspective. Obviously, the same holds true with churches, but those are still kind of somewhat intact. Actually, we'll be reading a poem relatively soon by Philip Larkin entitled Church Going, where this issue of ruins and decay comes into play again. So you might want to just remember what we're talking about here. But then he starts talking about the people associated with this. So stones only, the disjecta membra of this great house, whose moth-like girls are mixed with candle dust. Okay, The moth-like girls, moth-like is kind of a curious adjectival construction. Moth-like, like a moth. A moth is kind of flighty and skittish. And so the moth-like girls seem like they're perhaps timid, slightly frightened and flighty. And they're mixed with candle dust. Candle dust is what's left when you burn a candle down to the end, that wax and just the residue that remains. So it's kind of like something going to its end. So the girls are gone. So stones only, the disjecta member of this great house, whose moth-like girls are mixed with candle dust, remain to file the lizard's dragonish claws. And so the stones, that third line, fits with the first line. The stones are there to file the lizard's claws. And the lizard's dragonish claws give, again, a sort of an image of a monster, something that's taking it back. The mouths of those gate cherubs shriek with stain. Okay? A cherub is an angel, and a gate cherub would be referencing a statue at the end of a driveway, where typically, if you've ever been to a large, imposing house, very often they'll use sculptures to mark the pathway leading to the house. And so these gate cherubs are statues of angels that stand at the edge of the pathway leading to the house. But the mouths of those gate cherubs shriek with stain. Shriek, to scream, is a very loaded verb here. But they shriek with stain. The mouths of the cherubs are open, and it seems like they're discolored. The stain is mold or some, residue because they haven't been taken care of. If you leave a sculpture out in the elements, particularly in a tropical environment, moss or other things will start to grow, and the statue will become disfigured. So here, the disfiguring is a stain on the face of the gate cherub of the statue. But it's also, metaphorically speaking, the gate cherubs, these angels, are shrieking, they're screaming, and they may be complaining, they may be very upset about something. Axle and coach wheel silted under the muck of cattle droppings. 3 crows flap for the trees and settle, creaking the eucalyptus boughs. Okay? Here you have an image of the wheels of the wagons that come and go, silted under the muck of cattle droppings. Silt is a very strong image within this poem. Silt is fine sediment that starts to clog a river. It's when it's from erosion. It's fine particulate matter that's carried by water. And so when silt starts to build up, it starts to impede the flow of a river or of a stream. And so it has kind of an image here of decay. It's associated with cattle droppings and muck. Okay, and so the axle and coach wheel silted under the muck is suggesting that the wheels that used to roll and that used to be part of commerce and whatever else are no longer in use. It's an image of disuse. This place has fallen into disrepair, neglect, and decay. And so that's very prominent. The 3 crows flap in the trees and settle, creaking in the eucalyptus boughs. The 3 crows are kind of an ominous image, right? The black birds, they typically have a bit of an aura of foreboding, as if they're predicting something terrible to come or that has already come, perhaps. The smell of dead limes quickens in the nose, the leprosy of empire. This is another repeated image, much like the image of silt in the poem, this clogging, decaying. The image of limes is a very strong one. Limes are an interesting usage for Walcott, because limes are associated with the nickname for British people. British people are sometimes called limey. It's a derogatory term. You shouldn't call British people limey. They don't enjoy it very much. But limey and limes are associated with issues related to the British Navy during the heyday of the British Empire. And the reason for that is that when you are at sea for a long time, you can suffer due to the food that you eat. There's a disease You probably, if you studied your history in Quebec with regards to Jacques Cartier and the early colonization of Quebec, Jacques Cartier and his sailors got scurvy. Scurvy is a disease where you have a lack of vitamin C. And the First Nation people here who greeted them, helped them. I believe they gave them cedar bark, some sort of tree bark that had a high vitamin C content in it, and helped them survive because scurvy is a horrible disease. And it's basically, if you're on a ship for a long time, you don't have fresh vegetables. You bring dried meats and dried breads and things with you, but you don't have anything fresh. And so after months and months of not eating any fresh vegetables, you start to have a deficiency of vitamin C. And so in the British Navy, in the 1800s in particular, they started to become aware that sailors suffered from this. And so they brought limes. Limes are, those small green citrus fruit that you can juice, and it's very, very high in vitamin C and citrus. So, and they also keep reasonably well. They're kind of hard outside, so you can have them. It's not like a banana or something that gets rotten in a few days. A lime will keep for quite a while. So the British Navy typically brought limes with them when they went. And here, the lime is a recurring symbol. Now, in this particular line of the poem, a smell of dead limes quickens in the nose. That's a slightly curious framing and a phrasing that Walcott is using. To quicken means to come to life. It's actually a term associated with a stage in human gestation when a woman is pregnant and the baby starts to move in her womb. It starts to become recognizable. It has a heartbeat and things like that. It's referred to as quickening. And so here the phrasing, the smell of dead limes quickens in the nose, is implying that it comes to life. And to quicken is being brought to life. Now the phrase here, dead limes, is kind of contradictory. Dead limes coming to life. But the dead limes are an image of decay. A smell of dead limes quickens in the nose. The leprosy of empire. Coming back to the previous reference, the British Empire, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The leprosy of empire is once again a strong statement of decay. And we can go back to that previous line to see a smell of dead limes quickens in the nose. Quick lime is also a chemical compound. I believe it's calcium calcinate. It's a white powder. You sometimes refer to it as lime or quick lime, but it's a powder, and it has a very strong, I believe it's a very basic quality. So it has a very low pH, and it's corrosive. And the thing about quicklime is we often use it when something is dead and you want it to decay quickly. You'll sprinkle quicklime on it, and it will make, for example, if there's a dead squirrel in your backyard and you kind of want to get rid of the smell, if you sprinkle this substance on it, it will make the flesh dissolve quickly and disappear. So here you have a strange poetic line where he's talking about this sense of decay through the image of the limes. And the second line that follows it makes that more pronounced. Leprosy of empire. And leprosy is a disease of the skin. It's very contagious. It was typically very, very stigmatized. Lepers were put in colonies, and they were quarantined, something you might be familiar with. They were separated from the population at large because the disease was contagious. If you touched a leper, you could catch the disease from them. One of Jesus's famous parables was when he goes and visits the lepers, and he actually treats them humanely, because most of the time they were shunned because their skin starts to decay and they look quite gross, and people are rather frightened of lepers and leprosy, the disease that afflicts them. And so here we have leprosy, a disease, connected to the noun empire. So we have the leprosy of empire, which suggests that there's something horrible, something diseased about empire. And what would that be? Now, you probably noticed in what we've talked about with the poem so far that there's an accumulation of foreboding, distressing, ominous imagery, there's something happening here that's wrong. There's something, it's almost like when you're watching a horror movie and, you know, the young people decide to let's go down into the basement and see what we can find there. And you know that something horrible is going to happen to them, and the tone of the music starts to change and things get all, all dodgy. So in this poem, we have something similar, this accumulation of imagery associated with negative things. Farewell, green fields, farewell, ye happy groves. Okay, those are quotes from poetry by William Blake. And we're going to see in this particular poem that Walcott spends a great deal of time either quoting or making direct allusion to poets and prominent literary figures. And it's not exactly clear what he's up to here, but it's very prominent. We've already seen Thomas Browne. Now we have William Blake, and we'll see many more in the coming lines. He's kind of invoking this rich British poetic tradition and sort of associating himself with it with a little bit of ambiguity. He's not fully or only comfortable there. So farewell, green fields, farewell, ye happy groves. Marble, like Greece, like Faulkner's south in stone. Faulkner is another literary allusion. William Faulkner, one of the great American writers, a writer of mostly of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, early to mid 20th century. And he wrote mostly about the American South, and he wrote mostly about the moral stain of slavery and how it affected people, even though generations later, his novels were written in the 1930s and the 1940s, generations after the Civil War and generations after the people who owned slaves in Mississippi and in Alabama. The stigma and as I said, the moral stain of what they had done resonated on them. And so we have marble, like Greece, marble, those statues, the Parthenon, and all those wonderful Greek sculptures, like Faulkner's South in stone. Okay, he's making a connection there. Once again, there's a strong connection to the slave tradition of the South, just brought about by the literary allusion to Faulkner and the South. Deciduous beauty prospered and is gone. Deciduous is a word that means, it's a word to describe trees that lose their leaves. So you have deciduous trees, which if you look out in the winter time, those are the trees that have bare boughs. There's nothing on them. And then you have evergreen conifers, things that don't lose their leaves, right? They stay growing. If you have one of those, a spruce or a pine tree in your backyard and you go look out, it's still very green, right? So deciduous trees shed their leaves. So deciduous beauty prospered and is gone. It is implying using deciduous as a modifier for beauty is suggesting something seasonal, temporary, right? And if you think of a plant in spring or in summer, a deciduous tree grows and flourishes. The leaves grow and it becomes very abundant, very green. But then as the autumn comes, the trees start to change. The leaves change color and eventually they fall off. And in the winter, it's barren. And so using it to connect to beauty is sort of making a connection to this place. Maybe we're talking about plants and growth, but maybe we're talking about the place itself. Deciduous beauty prospered. Now again, this is an agricultural image. The slave house prospered due to agricultural growth, and then it's gone. So the leaves fell off the tree or the tree died. And so there's a sense of a temporary nature of this beauty. The poem continues, but where the lawn breaks in a rash of trees, a spade below dead leaves will wring the bone of some dead animal or human thing fallen from evil days, from evil times. Okay? You're starting to see that accretion, that accumulation of imagery and foreboding and ominous signs. So where the lawn breaks from a rash of trees, okay, the lawn ends, because what happens with a lawn is a place where you've cleared out the area and you've put grass there. And if you maintain it, you go out and mow your lawn, eventually you have a nice lawn and you have a place where you can sit where it's clear and open. But if you leave it for 5 years or 10 years, the lawn will start to grow, and eventually it will be colonized by trees and by other things. And so it won't look like a nice, neat, trimmed lawn anymore. It'll look like something else. So where the lawn breaks in a rash of trees, rash is, something like a skin irritation. So it's, again, a weird usage. Once again, related to decay, related to disease. A spade below dead leaves will wring the bone of some dead animal or human thing. Okay, a spade is a shovel, right? A pointed shovel that you use to dig. And so a spade below the dead leaves, if you're digging through the ground and you go through these layers of leaves from the deciduous beauty that have fallen, you will wring something, a bone of some dead animal. Okay, once again, dead, a word that's repeated again and again. We have dead limes, several lines back. Then you have dead leaves, dead animal. Okay, so we have this image of death, repetitive image of death that is, again, accumulating on us. So a spade below dead leaves will wring the bone of some dead animal or human thing. In other words, it will hit, the spade will hit the bone, and it will ring, it will make a sound, metal hitting bone. If you're going through dirt, the spade cuts into the dirt and it's not a problem. But if it hits bone, it makes a sharp sound. So it will ring the bone of some animal or human thing. Human thing is another strange phrasing. A human thing could be a thing that belonged to a human. Perhaps I had a cigarette lighter or a pen in my pocket and it fell out and it goes into the soil, and that would be a human thing, a thing possessed by humans. But in the context of the slavery and everything else that we've seen of this poem, human thing could also refer to a human who was not quite a human. If we think of a person, when we have a noun, we think of a person, a place, or a thing, and we use the pronouns he or she to talk about a person, but we use the pronoun it to talk about something that's not a person. And here, a human thing might be a human that's not fully human, and certainly in the context of slavery, we could see that being the case. So the spade below dead leaves will wring the bone of some dead animal or human thing fallen from evil days, from evil times. And again, that repetitive nature of dead that we've seen previously is now being reiterated with evil, fallen from evil days, from evil times. And again, fallen could imply something that drops, as I mentioned, a cigarette lighter or something of the sort, but it could also be fallen as in deceased from evil days and evil times, perhaps killed. It seems that the original crops were limes, grown in that silt that clogs the river's skirt. Again, images that we've seen previously. The limes associated with quicklime, with decay, the silt, the accumulating soil, clogging. Here it's clogs the river's skirt. The river's skirt can refer to the edge of the river. So as the erosion comes, the river gets narrower and narrower because the soil is filling it in. But it can also be, obviously, a female piece of clothing. A skirt is something that a young woman wears. And so here we have kind of a weird double sense with this decay and this word. The imperious rakes are gone, their bright girls gone, the river flows obliterating hurt. Now we're starting to see, you should be starting to see what the poem is actually saying. And the poem has a very dark and I would say somewhat disturbing message. Imperious is related to imperial, related to empire, but imperious also means kind of having a very high impression of itself. Rake also can relate back to the spade that we saw a few lines back. A rake is a tool that you use if you want to rake leaves. We've seen this reference to dead leaves. And a rake is something that you would use to gather up those dead leaves and do something with them, dispose of them. But a rake is also an expression used to talk about a man who is not very good with women, takes advantage of them, particularly sexually, that is kind of wants to take advantage of a woman and then doesn't have any compunction about leaving her behind. So a rake is somebody who kind of has an attitude about relationships with women, a man who has an attitude about relationships with women that's not what we might call forthright and positive. And so the imperious rakes are gone. The double sense of that phrasing, we can now see that to be referring to perhaps the slave owner who was at the heart of this great house. The imperious rakes are him and people like him. They're bright girls gone. Once again, if we look in the early lines of the poem, we have those moth-like girls that are mixed with candle dust. Okay, now we come back to those bright girls. Bright girls are gone. So probably at a certain point, it's girl, it's not woman. Okay, they were young, vibrant, vital women, and they've been perhaps treated badly by the imperious rakes. And we don't know exactly what's going on here, but we have a sense that it's something bad. We've seen images of people buried beneath the dead leaves, the spade trying to dig them up. So we have this sort of subtly alluded to horrific, unspoken truth. The river flows, obliterating hurt. Okay, the river flowing, again, we've seen the silt clogging the river. The river flows is once again one of those images of the passage of time. The river flows, obliterating hurt, because the people are gone and what happened here is gone. But at another level, it's not really gone, because the poem is precisely conjuring whatever it is that did happen here, and suggesting that it's, even though it's done, it's still lingering. The poem is about this sense of the place and what happened in this place. I climbed a wall. Here we have an I, right? So we have the persona. The first time that we've really seen the persona in the poem, okay? We know that there's been somebody observing this situation, and we know that that person is perceptive about what's happened, and the choice of words that are being used here are also evocative to conjure some of that darkness and some of that distressing reality, okay? I climbed a wall with the grill ironwork of exiled craftsmen protecting that great house from guilt, perhaps, but not from the worm's rent, nor from the padded cavalry of the mouse. Okay, so he climbs a wall and he finds the grill ironwork, right? This very elaborate, detailed ironwork of exiled craftsmen. Now, why are they exiled, the craftsmen who built this house? Once again, we're talking about slaves. They're exiled. They're not there anymore. They're somewhere else. But they're also exiled because they're probably brought from somewhere else to come here. These craftsmen, they're no longer these things, these human things. They're craftsmen, people who have some sort of value. But they're taken away from what they were, where they were from, and brought somewhere else where they didn't necessarily pertain. So protecting that house, this is the grill ironwork, the ironwork on the outside of the house. That is protection, right? You put ironwork over your window so that people can't come in. Protecting that house from guilt, perhaps. Now, how does it protect the house from guilt? Guilt is a curious word here. Guilt is a curious word because guilt, G-U-I-L-T, related to guilty, relating to feeling bad about something you did that was wrong. But guilt is also a word that we've seen earlier in the semester, right, with Shakespeare, neither the gilded monuments of princes. Gilt, G-I-L-T, is referring to something coated, a metal work covered in valuable metal, typically gold. So when something is gilded or gilt, it is given value through a patina a very, very thin layer, a veneer of gold or silver on the outside. And so there's kind of a curious term here because he's talking about metalwork and guilt, but he's also talking about guilt as in having a guilty conscience. So the grill ironwork of exiled craftsmen protecting that great house from guilt, perhaps, but not from the worm's rent, nor from the padded cavalry of the mouse. So the house is being protected in some way, but not really. The worm's rent, the worm, the symbol of biological decay, and the padded cavalry of the mouse. And when a wind shook in the limes, I heard what Kipling heard, the death of a great empire, the abuse of ignorance by Bible and by sword. Okay, Kipling, another literary allusion, reference to Rudyard Kipling, a writer who is strongly associated with the British colony in India. He wrote something called The Jungle Book. When you were growing up, you may have seen the Disney film version of that. And he wrote something called Kim, and he's very much known as a poet of empire. And he was typically fairly racist in his attitudes. And he wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden as well. This idea of the white man in this place with dark men who has a kind of a moral obligation to treat them in a certain way. So once again, he's brought through a literary reference, a literary allusion, he's brought a whole slew of associations that fit the bill of what he's saying. And again, we're conjuring this literary tradition here that has a meaning. So what Kipling heard, the death of a great empire, the abuse of ignorance by Bible and by sword, right? Those are the classic tools of the colonizer. You come with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, and you choose because you're going to be converted to Christianity, because these people, these primitive people from other places were not Christians when the Europeans came to meet them. And if they don't do it by the book, then they do it by the sword, by violence. And so there's kind of an inherent oppressive reality there. A green lawn broken by low walls of stone, dipped to the rivulet and pacing. I thought next of men like Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, Drake, ancestral murders and poets. Here we have a list of several poets, Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, and Drake. These are all poets of the Elizabethan era, and they were typically both colonizers. They came to the Americas. They were explorers, they were adventurers, and they were also poets. And of course, Walcott's conjuring of them is curious here. He refers to them as ancestral murderers and poets. Ancestral murderers can be read two ways. An ancestral murderer can be your ancestor, who is a murderer. That would be an ancestral murderer. My uncle who murdered someone is an ancestral murderer. Or it could be murderers of your ancestors. Now what's curious about the double sense here for Walcott is that having his British identity and his African identity, he has a double sense there. He has this identity with the colonizers and another sense of his identity with the colonized. And so in referring to, we can see in the three allusions there are Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, and Drake, that he's referring to these British poets of empire in a certain way, respectful of them. They're poets. They're part of that tribe that he's a part of, that group of poets, but they're also colonizers. And so on the one hand, he has an affinity with them, a connection to them, and on the other hand, he has a disdain for them, right? And of course, he continues in describing them, more perplexed in memory now by every ulcerous crime. He's confused, he's perplexed, he doesn't know what to think, because these people that he respects, this literary tradition that he's a part of, that he identifies with, is also the same thing that is associated with the subjugation of these people, of his people, and people associated with him. And so he's starting to realize the confusion here. Ancestral murderers and poets. On the one hand, a positive identification, and on the other hand, a very negative identification. And of course, every ulcerous crime, ulcerous something that irritates and causes pain and damages tissue, right? So it's a horrible, he's starting to realize that these people have some level of culpability here. The world's green age then was rotting lime, whose stench became the charnel gallion's text. The world's green age, okay, that image of abundance, the early period of prosperity we've seen with the deciduous beauty, okay, was a rotting lime, okay, again, rotting associated with lime, that reiteration again and again of decay, the image of decay associated with the lime, okay, associated with Britain, associated with the legacy of British Empire, the British Navy. And so the world's green age then was rotting lime, whose stench, the disgusting smell, became the charnel gallion's text. The charnel galleon is a reference to a slave ship. Okay, charnel galleon is a ship that carries people, human cargo. Typically, it was the transatlantic slave trade, bringing these people from Africa to the Caribbean, to the Americas, to be workers, and not only workers, but slaves, enslaved workers, people who worked but who did not have their humanity recognized. And so the world's green age then was rotting lime, whose stench became the charnel gallion's text. In other words, the text, the reference to this, is precisely the symbols of those crimes. And so we have the prosperity, and we have the cost and the price behind the prosperity. The rot remains with us, the men are gone. It's a pretty important line for the poem, right? He's been talking about this rot the whole time. He's been talking about it disappearing. He's saying the men are gone, the people who were the victims of this, the victims and the victimizers, because the men who did the enslaving and the men who were enslaved and the women who were enslaved, and that seems to be a big part of it here, the women, they're dead. They died long ago and their bodies are no longer there in whatever sense. The rot remains with us. The poison, the contamination of the actions that these people undertook are still there, even though they are not. But as dead ash is lifted in a wind that fans the blackening ember of the mind, my eyes burned from the ashen prose of Donne. Okay, we remember here another poetic reference, one that you should be able to make. John Donne, the poet we saw earlier in the semester, Valediction Forbidding Mourning, The Flea. John Donne is a great British poet, and actually he's going to be quoted at the end of this poem. And he's talking about the ashen prose of Donne, the blackening ember of the mind, dead ash, again, reiteration of imagery. Ash, the thing that's left when you burn something. So once again, strong association with decay. As dead ash is lifted in the wind, my eyes, in the wind that fans the blackening ember of the mind, my eyes burned from the ashen prose of Donne. And all this ash is associated with the legacy of fire, the aftermath of fire. Ablaze with rage, I thought some slave is rotting in this manorial lake. Okay, and there you have, another poignant line of the poem. We've been looking at this lake, we've been looking at this grass, and there's the corpses of these people lurking beneath it. This manorial lake, a manor, is, the place of prosperity, but the manorial lake has a slave rotting in it. So the rot and the legacy is still there, and that body is lurking, when they say skeletons in the closet kind of thing, that you have these stories lurking behind you that are still there, that mock you, and that you can run from, but you can't really hide from them. They stay there. And so we move to the end of the poem. We have this culmination where the slave is rotting in the manorial lake, but still the coal of my compassion fought that Albion too was once a colony like ours, part of the continent piece of the main. Albion is the traditional historical way of referring to England, mythically. So England was at one point in the past a colonial outpost, which is true. England was a colony. Rome the Romans. Caesar came to England. And so Albion too was once a colony like ours, part of the continent, piece of the main, rook-shotten rock overblown, nook-shotten rook o'erblown, deranged by foaming channels in the vain expanse of bitter faction. Okay, so the place where he thinks of as this center of culture and civilization was itself previously a colonial outpost. And here, the last lines of the poem refer to John Donne, one of John Donne's meditations. All in compassion ends. We have him previously referring to the coal of his compassion, referring to those embers of his mind. And so he's starting to, compassion is a sense of understanding, coming to grips, right? To be compassionate is to sort of understand particularly the motivations of someone else. And so his conflicted conscience in this poem is resolving itself in compassion. All in compassion ends, so differently from what the heart arranged, as if a manner of thy friends, right? And the reference, again, is to Donne. Donne is referred to twice in the last lines of the poem, where he talks about as if a manner of your friends was washed into the sea, as if it's the whole island, right? One little piece of it will end up representing the whole of the island. And of course, that's a pretty beautiful metaphor to bring to close this particular poem, because he's talking about an island, and he's making this equation between the island that he's standing on, which is, excuse me, I'm going to find the reference here directly. Anyways, I don't find the reference directly. It's not that important. But basically, he's equating the island of England as a colonial outpost to this island that he's standing on. It's an unnamed Caribbean island, but the sense is that what happens here is kind of microcosmic view. And if something happens, you have kind of civilization rests on all of our behavior together. So the poem resolves itself at the end in kind of a compassionate stance that he's coming to grips with the conflicted nature of his identity. So those last lines come from Donne's Meditation 17, Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, written in 1624. And Donne says, no man is an island entire of itself. Each man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. So in citing that, misquoting it, by the way, which we've seen previously, much like Keats gets his facts wrong about Cortez discovering the Pacific. Here, Walcott misquotes John Donne's Meditation 17, but that's not terribly relevant for the purposes of the poem, because the image that he conjures there, that if a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or thine own were. In other words, that everybody, the little things there have a big resonance, and so we kind of need to give an importance, whether it's what seems infinitesimally small may in fact have much more consequence. And so coming back to the overall sweep of the poem, you start to see a rather beautiful bookending. He starts with Thomas Browne's Urn Burial, and he ends with John Donne, and both of these have this sense of the value of life and this kind of mourning quality to them that the poem is very enriched by. And so this rather extended meditation on the legacy of slavery, and it doesn't, I don't think the poem has a very clear and direct resolution, because there's an ambivalence to it. As I said, Walcott is wrapped up in his hybridized dual identity as African and as Englishman. indirectly Englishmen. And so he's trying to see both sides of this story. And I think as a result, the poem is quite rich. If we come back to that post-colonial reading, obviously, there's a great deal that can be said. One of the term paper topics that I proposed with respect to this particular poem deals with a quotation from an essay that Walcott wrote. It's actually a book, but the essay is entitled The Antilles Fragments of an Epic Memory. And he talks a little bit about fragmentation. The quote talks about breaking up a vase and how when you reassemble the pieces, you get something greater than the original because you have the love that built it, but then you also have the love that reassembled it. And it's an essay about decay and about deconstructing sort of these realities. And I think it fits quite nicely with this poem. So if any of you are working on that topic, obviously the image of the decay of the great house, you can make a very direct link to the broken vase in Walcott's quote. So I think I'll end on that note. You should now proceed to the question sets, and you should answer those questions to the best of your ability. And we will be having a video conference to address those questions if you have difficulty answering them. So there will be a Skype invitation being sent to your Mio inbox shortly, so you should check for it. So have a nice day. I'll talk to you soon.